Gemini and OAI. Today's story has a big twist at the end that has fascinated the internet for decades. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. And we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button over to your house for a pizza party, but then only serve them fermented herring. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. The Playground of the Gods. Japan is comprised of 4 major islands. The northernmost island is called Hokkaido, and on Hokkaido, there is this beautiful national park called Daisetsuzum that is nicknamed the Playground of the Gods because the park is basically all these huge mountains that stretch up into the clouds. The tallest mountain inside of this park is Mount Asahi Dake, which reaches an elevation over 7,500 feet, and it is a very popular hiking destination. The trail that brings you to the summit of Mount Asahi Dake is considered relatively straightforward. It's pretty much just a straight line. But there is one very tricky spot on the way up. As you get closer and closer to the summit, the trees begin to disappear, and you're left with this kind of open landscape where the trail becomes fairly ambiguous. It's hard to know where you're going. And so, hikers are instructed to look for a landmark, which is this big square boulder that's known as Safe Rock. And once you get to Safe Rock, apparently the rest of the trail is easy to identify and follow all the way up to the summit. There's a catch, though. In the same area as Safe Rock is another large square boulder that looks exactly like Safe Rock. And this imposter is called False Safe Rock. If a hiker confuses False Safe Rock for the real thing and then attempts to take the path leading away from the imposter, they will be led down a path that many people have gotten lost on. At first, it will feel like you are making progress towards the summit of the mountain, but eventually, the trail begins to gradually go downhill. Now, you would think that would be a fairly obvious red flag. If the trail is going down and you're trying to go up to the summit, that probably something's gone wrong here. You've taken a wrong turn. But put yourself in the mind of someone who's made this mistake in their mind. They reached the landmark of Safe Rock, although it was the imposter all. False Safe Rockin', so they think they're on the right path. And if this is their first time being on this mountain, which for a lot of people it is, they'd probably convince themselves that they've gone the right way and just keep on going. And so, if you just keep on going and you don't recognize this mistake, about a mile away from False Safe Rock, you enter into this valley that's completely overgrown with thick bamboo. It's very swampy, and there's lots of very steep cliff drop-offs. And once you go inside of this area, you can't see anything because the bamboo is so tall and so thick, and so it's very easy to get turned around. And it's pretty easy to accidentally walk off of a cliff. And so, over the years, hikers who have accidentally taken the trail leading away from False Safe Rock have gotten lost in this treacherous area, and not all of them have come back. The LS signal. In July of 1989, 2 men from Tokyo were hiking up the trail towards the summit of Mount Asahi Dake when they reached what they believed was Safe Rock. However, it was not. It was False Safe Rock. And so, when they followed the trail leading away from False Safe Rock, it was not long before they were lost in that valley overgrown with bamboo. That night, when these 2 men did not come home, their friends and family called the police, and a search was launched for them. Over the first couple of days, there was no luck. They could not find these 2 guys. They had no idea where they had gone. They looked all over the swampy area thinking that's where they might be, but they couldn't find them. But then, on July 24th, a helicopter was flying over the mountain, over an area that had not really been thoroughly searched. It was just to the east of that valley with all the bamboo where they expected them to be. And this helicopter pilot, as he went around a corner, he got a view down to the midsection of the mountain, and he saw this big wide open clearing. And right in the middle of this clearing are 3 huge letters. They are spelled using birch logs, and the 3 letters are LS. LS is an international code used to signal extreme distress. People who go missing or who get stranded somewhere, they will try to spell the 3 letters OS as big as they possibly can, and then they will camp out near their signal in hopes that someone will see it and then come and rescue them. This helicopter pilot that seen this distress signal immediately flew over the letters, expecting to look down and see the 2 missing hikers from Tokyo. But when he was hovering over the OS and he's looking down, there is no one there when there one. Despite the fact that this was a wide open area, they are not in the Bamboo Valley anymore, but either way, he signaled to the rest of the search party that he had found their OS signal. And before long, more helicopters and search teams were brought over to that area. And then several hours later, a search team that was on the ground, who was walking about 2 miles north of this OS signal, saw these 2 very haggard-looking guys come out of the bamboo brush, and they come walking up towards them. And it turns out it was the missing men from Tokyo. Very ragged, they were dehydrated and famished, and they were kind of on the brink of death, but they were alive, and they were extremely happy to have been found. And so, a helicopter was brought in. The 2 men were flown out to the nearest hospital, and then after receiving medical care, it was determined they would both make full recoveries. Excited by this news, the pilot and some of the other rescuers went to the men's hospital room to pay them a visit. And over the course of their conversation, the pilot brings up to the 2 men that they were really smart to build that OS signal, that, in fact, had they not built the OS, it's unlikely anyone would have found them. And as soon as the 2 men heard this, they kind of reacted to it. They looked at each other, then they looked at the pilot and they said, "What OS signal? We didn't make an OS signal." The discovery of Kenji Iwamariua. After asking the men several questions to make sure they really didn't make this signal, the pilot and the rest of the searchers said, "You know, we have to go back to the mountain. We have to go back to the OS signal because somebody else has made it and they need our help." And so, early the next morning, the searchers went back out to the mountain, back to the OS signal, to scour the area all over again. And shortly after they began the search, one of the searchers found this deep hole underneath the roots of a tree. And in this hole was a backpack. And in this backpack, amongst other things, was a driver's license and an audio recorder. The license belonged to a 25-year-old Japanese man named Kenji Iwamariua, who 5 years earlier had been staying at a lodge near the mountain. And one day he had left, and on his way out, he had told the owner of this lodge that he was going for a hike to the summit of Mount Asahi Dake. A couple of days later, when Kenji was supposed to check out of the lodge, he didn't. And so, the owner went to his room, he knocked, but there was no answer. And so, the owner used his master key, he opened the door, and when he looked inside, there was no Kenji, but all of his belongings were still there. And so the owner thought that was odd because the last time he saw him, he was going out for this hike. And so he put 2 and 2 together and thought, "You know what? I think this guy's in trouble." So he called the police and reported him missing. A search is launched for Kenji, but Kenji was never found. And so there was always this mystery about what happened to him. Fast forward back to 1989, and these searchers are looking at this backpack. They've just looked at this license, and then one of the searchers reaches in and pulls out the audio recorder and hits the play button. What they heard was very disturbing. It was the sound of a young man, presumably who was very distressed, who was calling out for help. And it's believed this young man is Kenji. In Japanese, he very slowly and deliberately says, I'm stuck on a cliff. I can't move. OS, please help me. I'm at the spot where I first saw the helicopter, but the bamboo is too thick. I can't move. Please lift me up out of here. OS. At this point, it seemed fairly obvious to police that based on the proximity of the backpack to the OS letters, and the fact that the recording, which was in the backpack, had Kenji literally saying OS, he says this on the recording, that Kenji must have been the one who built this OS sign. He must have built it back in 1980 for when he got lost. And so now that the police believed they had solved the mystery of who built the OS sign, they now needed to figure out where this person went. Where was Kenji? And so, over the next several hours, searchers continued to look around the immediate area of where this backpack was found. And soon they would discover something that, according to police, solved this 5-year-old mystery. They figured out what happened to Kenji. Now, there's no official police narrative, at least not online, that explains step by step what happened to Kenji. So what I'm about to share with you is what I was able to deduce from all of the official reporting that I could find online. The deduction. In 1984, Kenji left his lodge and headed for the summit of Mount Ahi-Date. And on the way up, he most likely mistook the false safe rock for the safe rock for the safe rock. And just like the two men from Tokyo would do 5 years later, Kenji went down the wrong path and got lost in that valley covered in bamboo. At some point, Kenji stopped trying to find his way back to the trail and instead tried to just go down the mountain anyway. And so, as he's making his way through this very thick vegetation and this bamboo, he eventually gets to a point where he lowers himself down over this ledge and he lands on this cliff. And as soon as he lands, he looks over the edge and he realizes he can't go any farther. It's too steep. It's too dangerous. But when he turns around to try to climb back up, it's also too steep. So, he was trapped on this ledge. And so, there on this cliff ledge, he sits and waits, hoping that someone has reported him missing and they will come and find him before he dies. And at some point as he's sitting there waiting, a helicopter flies overhead. And Shinji most likely was elated. He probably believed they saw him, and he thought he was going to get rescued. But the helicopter would eventually just fly away, giving no indication of whether they had actually seen Kenji. And so, for what must have been at least a couple of days, Kenji sat on this ledge expecting this helicopter to come back. But over time, he gradually came to the conclusion that that helicopter had probably not seen him. They were not coming back. There was no rescue party inbound for him. And so, it was around that time, as he's having this horrible realization, that he pulls out that audio recorder and he records that very eerie and distressing message where he's calling out for help and saying that he's stuck on this ledge. And then, after he was done at some point, Kenji came to the conclusion that his best chance at survival was not waiting for some helicopter to potentially come back, because at this point, that seemed really unlikely. Instead, his best chance, and perhaps only chance, was to try to climb down this cliff right in front of him that he had already determined was weighted dangerous. And so, Kenji lowered himself and began climbing down this cliff, and miraculously, he got all the way to the bottom where the ground leveled off without serious injury. And so from that point, he just kept on walking down the mountain, trudging through all this bamboo, until he actually leaves the bamboo. And enters this huge clearing on the side of the mountain, or basically, it's devoid of any vegetation besides some birch trees off in the distance. And it was in this clearing that Kenji would construct that OS signal, believing that was his ticket out of there. But unfortunately, it was not. 5 years later, after searchers had just located Kenji's backpack underneath the roots of that tree, they would go on to make that huge discovery that solved the 5-year mystery. And that discovery was a partial human skeleton laying nearby. And eventually, that skeleton would be determined to be Kenji's. And at this point, the police said they were not suspecting foul play in Kenji's death. However, they did not release his exact cause of death. It's unclear if they just could not determine it, or if they didn't want to release it publicly. But either way, we don't know what it is. And then after that, the police just closed the case and said, okay, we're done. The discrepancy. But to the people who had been closely following this story, because this was a big deal at the time in 1989, they thought the police were kind of missing something. There was this obvious huge discrepancy that they all figured the police were going to address at some point. And now it seemed like they weren't. And a lot of people felt like this is not a discrepancy you can just sweep under the rug. This is a really big deal. And that discrepancy was, how could Kenji have made that LS signal? As a reminder, the 3 letters LS that were found in that clearing, they were made with 19 birch tree logs. Each letter was 16 feet tall and 10 feet wide. And each birch tree log that made these letters up, they were all about the same length and appeared to have been expertly cut. indicating they had been chopped with an axe or some other cutting tool. And where this OS was actually located in that clearing, it was several hundred feet away from the other birch trees. So on top of the enormous effort that would go into cutting down 19 trees with an axe, and I can assure you that cutting down a tree with an axe or a hatchet is way harder than you think it is, Kenji would have also had to expend a lot of additional energy just dragging the felled logs over to the emergency area where he actually built the signal. Basically, this was a gargantuan ask that even for someone who was fit and healthy and strong in the best of conditions, they would still struggle with this. And so the idea that Kenji, after being missing in the wild for several days, he's probably dehydrated, he's famished, he's tired, he's sore, he's scared. He's in the worst possible shape you can be in. The idea that he pulled this off is kind of unbelievable. And in fact, the person who did Kenji's autopsy would say that Kenji was not physically capable of putting together that OS signal. It was just a week. And there's another complication to factor in. There was no axe or any other cutting tool found anywhere near the OS signal, near the skeleton, near the backpack. Nowhere. There is no cutting tool. So, either Kenji did have an axe and somehow mustered the superhuman strength necessary to chop down 19 trees and then he built this OS signal, in which case, why didn't the authorities find the axe? Or Kenji did not have an axe, in which case, why were there 19 perfectly cut birch logs just laying around in an area that virtually no one went intentionally? The theories. When the police just would not answer these simple questions about the axe, people began coming up with their own theories as to what happened. The most prominent theory was that Kenji was not actually alone. This would explain how he went about building that OS signal. He had help. And it would also explain why Kenji's family, when they heard that audio recording for the first time, they said, "That doesn't sound like our son." And so, according to this additional person theory, that recording wasn't of Kenji. It was of this other person, this additional person. People who subscribe to this theory also point out that originally, the skeleton was not classified as belonging to Kenji. It was classified as belonging to some unknown female with type O blood. The media and the public went crazy at this revelation, and very quickly the police were being hit with lots of questions about this development, which they had no idea what to say about it. And so they looked kind of bad in the media. They didn't have very many answers. They didn't have any leads. The pressure was building, and then all of a sudden the police say, we looked at the bones again, and it turns out they were not type O blood female. They were actually type O blood male. Male, which conveniently is the same sex and blood type as Kenji. Some say this was a pure fabrication by police to very conveniently tie up all the loose ends of a case they were doing a very bad job solving. That in reality, those were not Kenji's bones. Kenji's still somewhere out there, we haven't found him yet, and those bones belong to some unknown female with type O blood, and she was the additional person. But the reality is, even if this additional person theory is plausible, it's highly unlikely it will ever be looked at seriously by authorities because at this point, the case is considered closed. So, as of now, the only thing we can all say with certainty is that an OS sign on the side of this mountain saved the lives of two men from Tokyo in 1989. But exactly who the sign builder or builders were, and then what happened to them, still remains a mystery for many people. So that's gonna do it. Guys, if you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button over to your house for a pizza party. But when they get there, only serve them fermented herring. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and cups and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to Shop Mr. Ballin. Come. If you want to see upcoming deals and promotions in our store, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is Shop Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's John Ballin 416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. We also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page called Mr. Ballin, where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called our MR Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. See you, Gemini Noah. Today's story has a very distressing and graphic plot twist at the end, and so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do. And we upload once or twice every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button you're going to upload on your YouTube channel 3, 4, even 5 times every week, and then knock it down to 3 or 4 times a week, and then 2 or 3 times a week, and then 1 or 2 times a week, and then go ahead and just don't post for 3 weeks straight. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. The college town. Morgantown, West Virginia, is this beautiful place nestled at the bottom of this huge mountain range called the Green Mountains. It is a big-time college town as the famous West Virginia University is located there. And so, during the school year, the town is full of young people, and during the football season, the town is absolutely buzzing with excitement. But the college is not the only reason people live in Morgantown. Lots of families choose to live there because there's so much to do year-round. Also, it's relatively safe, and in general, it's an up-and-coming place with new shops and restaurants and museums popping up every single year. But despite all of that, Morgantown is also known for something absolutely terrible, and that is the story of Skylar Nees. In 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Nees was a sophomore in high school in Morgantown, West Virginia. She was a straight-A student and she worked part-time at a Wendy's, which is a fast food restaurant chain. And by all accounts, she was extremely well liked by her peers, her co-workers, and had many, many friends. She was the only child of Mary and David Nees, and they absolutely adored her. David in particular, who was this big, burly man's man, he said that he spoiled his daughter rotten. The parents would say their daughter was full of love and life, and she was fiercely loyal, and at times she could be absolutely hilarious. One of Dave's fondest memories is when Skylar was a very young girl. He was home taking care of her by himself, and that morning, as he's looking after her, she asked him if he will participate in one of her trademark tea parties. And so David, the ever-dutiful father, walks over and says, "Of course, I'll participate in your tea party." And he sits down in this little tiny pink chair, and his daughter, who's got her ballerina tattoo on, she's across the table and she's all smiles. And she sits down in her little pink chair, and she hands him this little plastic teacup. So he takes the teacup and he sees there's water already inside of it. And so he sips the tea inside of the cup and he says, "Oh, it's so good, honey. You did such a good job brewing this tea." And Skylar is just blushing. She is so happy and so thrilled that he liked her tea. Later that night, when Mary came home from work, she goes to her husband, Dave, and says, "Hey, how did it go? How was it looking after Skylar today?" And Dave would tell her about all the things they did, including their big tea party. And he would tell Mary that, this time she actually put water inside of the teacup, so it was actually like a real tea party. And Mary stops him and goes, "Hey, Skylar is not tall enough to reach the faucet. How could she have put water inside of those cups?" It turned out Skylar was using toilet water to fill the teacups. The disappearance. Fast forward to 2012. On the night of July 5th, 16-year-old Skylar Nees had just finished a night shift at the Wendy's restaurant and she just got home. She walks through the front door of her family's apartment, and as soon as she gets inside, she tells her parents she's really tired and she wants to go to bed. And so she hugged both of her parents. She told them that she loved them, and then Mary and Dave watched their daughter walk down the first floor hallway. And then they watched her open her bedroom door, go inside, and shut it behind her. The following morning, Mary and Dave both had to work, so they were up early. And Skylar was not up. She was still in her bedroom. Her door was still shut, and so they assumed she was just going to sleep in. And so Mary and Dave, they make breakfast, they're chatting, they're kind of doing their morning routine. And then when it was time to go to work, they decided, let's not bother Skylar. She worked late last night, let her sleep in. And so the parents, they leave without seeing or talking to their daughter. Later that afternoon, Dave would come home early from work. And he gets to the apartment, he goes inside, and it's quiet. Now, Mary was still at work, but Skylar at this point really should not have been asleep. It's like 2, 0, or 3, 0 o'clock in the afternoon. And so he's thinking, she's got to be up around here somewhere. And so he yells out to his daughter, hey, I'm home. Where are you? What are you up to? But there was no response. It was just silent. And so he walked down the first floor hallway towards his daughter's bedroom, and he saw the door was still shut. Now, she only kept that door shut when she was sleeping. And so he's thinking, okay, I guess she must still be asleep. This is really late in the afternoon, so I'm gonna knock on the door and see if she's okay. And so he knocks on the door and says, hey, Sky, it's late in the afternoon. You gotta get up for noon. But there was no answer. And when he listened to the door, there was no noise coming from the bedroom. So he thought that was pretty weird. And so he knocked a few more times. He yelled out a few more times. And when there was no response, no answer, no sound, he opened the door up. And when he looked inside, Skylar was not in there. Now, Dave was thinking to himself, I don't think my daughter told me that she would be gone today, or at least not right now. And he's trying to think, did she say something? Was she meeting someone today? And he couldn't think of it. So he just pulled his phone out and he called his daughter, but she didn't pick up. So he called his wife, Mary, and Mary's at work. Then Mary picks up, and Dave asked her, hey, have you seen Skylar? Or do you know where she is right now? And she would say, no, I don't know where she is. Maybe she's out with one of her friends. And so after Dave hung up the phone with his wife, he wound up calling one of Skylar's very closest friends. Her name was Sheila Eddy, and she had known Skylar since they were in 2nd grade. They were practically inseparable, and he had a good relationship with Sheila. And so he just calls Sheila and he says, hey, I haven't seen Skylar. She's gone right now. Do you know where she is? And Sheila would say, no, I'm sorry. I don't sorry. But I did talk to her last night, but there was nothing unusual about our interaction. It was just normal texting about, normal stuff. And so Dave said, okay, thank you. Well, if you could, can you please try to get in touch with Skylar? And if you do get in touch with her, please tell her to get in touch with us. Or if you hear anything about her, please just let me know. The evidence. After Dave hung up the phone with Sheila, he kind of stopped and just looked around his daughter's bedroom and thought, maybe there's some clue in here about where she's gone. And at first glance, really nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But when he walked around her bed and was looking inside of her closet, he saw the mesh screen that should have been mounted on the outside of her window was in her closet. And he's thinking, why is that in there? There's no reason for it to be in the closet. And so instinctively, he just turns around and walks over to the window that this screen is supposed to be on. And when he looks down at the bottom of the window, he sees it's open, barely, just enough where you could maybe get your fingernails underneath the window and pry it open. So Dave reaches down and opens this window all the way. And because there was no screen on this window, he just stuck his head all the way out the window. So his head is outside of the apartment. He's just kind of looking around, looking for some explanation of why this screen had been removed and put in her closet. And he got his explanation when he looked straight down and saw a McGrath outside, just several feet below this window because this is a first floor window. There was a bench, and the bench clearly had been moved there recently. For Dave, even though he had never heard of his daughter sneaking out of the house before, and really didn't think that was something she would do, he's looking around thinking, the evidence in her room and now outside of her room really indicates that that is exactly what she must have done the night before. She must have snuck out. But as he's processing this, he's also thinking, if she snuck out of the house last night and then, snuck back into her room, why didn't she replace the screen on the window? And why didn't she close the window all the way? And then this morning, before she left to go wherever she went, why didn't she go outside and move the bench from under her window back to where it was supposed to go to avoid suspicion? Why didn't she do that? And then it dawns on him that his daughter must have snuck out the night before, but not come back yet. She's still out wherever she went. Dave was very concerned. However, he's thinking, maybe there's a better explanation. Maybe I'm jumping to conclusions. Maybe she didn't sneak out. And so, he calls his wife to kind of just talk with her and figure out what they should do. And they decide, this is concerning, but let's just give her a couple of hours to turn back up again. I'm sure she's fine. And so, they begin to wait. And then at 4:00 p.m. that evening, Wendy's, the restaurant where Skylar worked, called Dave and said, "Hey, have you seen Skylar? She was supposed to work today and she didn't show up. She didn't call. It's very unlike her. What's going on?" This was the tipping point. Dave and Mary knew something had to be wrong, and so Dave called the police. Monongalia County 911, do you have an emergency? I have a 16-year-old daughter who apparently snuck out of her room last night. She has not been home, hasn't went to work, can't get a hold of her from any of her friends. I am scared to death. Has she done this before? No. The search. After Dave got off the phone, he and his wife began kind of frantically figuring out what they should do. While the police are out looking, should we go out and look too? Or should we stay here in case she comes home? And maybe she's hurt, maybe we can help her if she gets here. And so they're having this really difficult and stressful conversation when Mary's phone rings, and it's Sheila. And so Mary immediately answers it, hoping for some good news about her daughter. But Sheila asks Mary right away, "Hey, has Skylar come home yet?" And Mary says, "No, she hasn't. And in fact, we just got off the phone with the police because this makes sense. Something's wrong, and we're getting the police involved." And so when Sheila hears this, she kind of takes a deep breath, and then after a little bit of a hesitation, she says, "Mary, I gotta tell you the truth about last night." She would go on to explain that the night before, Skylar had snuck out of the house, and so had she, along with their other very close friend named Rachel Schoaf. Rachel was someone that Mary and Dave also knew very, very well. The three girls were kind of like best friends and totally inseparable. And so Sheila said the three of them snuck out, and in fact, they did this a lot, and they would drive around town and smoke marijuana together. But this was not the big reveal. Despite this being fairly shocking to Mary and Dave, this was not the big reveal. The big reveal was that when they went out and snuck out of their houses and smoked weed together, they would make sure they never drove their car. Whoever was driving would never drive directly in front of any of their houses because they were concerned the noise from the car could wake up parents, and then they'd get caught. And so the way they would do it is, after they snuck out of their house, they would walk a block or two away from their house. And then they would call or text the other two, and they'd get picked up and they'd go do their thing. And then when they got dropped off, they would get dropped off a block or two away from their home and then walk the rest of the way. And so Sheila told Mary that last night, like so many other nights, she dropped Skylar off about a block away from their apartment, and then Sheila and Rachel drove off. So they did not actually see Skylar enter her apartment, so they don't know for sure if she actually made it home okay. So this was obviously horrifying for Mary and Dave to hear, because it totally opened the door for their daughter to have been abducted during this walk from the drop-off point back to her apartment. And the street she was on was not well lit. It's the middle of the night. It's dark. She's potentially high on marijuana, and so it seemed like that was a very realistic thing that could have happened, as horrifying as it sounded. And so after Mary got off the phone with Sheila, she called the police and she updated them about what Sheila had told her. And then Mary and Dave met up with Sheila and Sheila's mother and began searching the immediate area around their apartment in hopes that maybe, she fell somewhere and she's trapped, and she just needs to be picked up or helped in some way. But after searching for several hours and knocking on dozens and dozens of doors, nobody saw anything, nobody knew anything. There was no sign of Skylar, and so as this group is totally down, they don't know what to do. They feel totally helpless. They know the police are out looking for Skylar, but they want to do something and they don't know what to do. And that's when Mary remembers there is a security camera on the outside of their apartment building that is looking down at the road. And so right away, the four of them literally run back to the apartment building. They go inside, they find the security manager, they explain the situation, and sure enough, he pulls up the footage from the night before. And the footage they see doesn't make sense. Sheila had dropped Skylar off on that corner, kind of out of view of the camera, at around midnight. But at 12:30, so 30 minutes after she's been dropped off, you see this unknown, kind of generic-looking car pull up right in front of the apartment complex. And then Skylar comes running across the lawn, goes right up to the car, opens the back door, hops in the back seat, shuts it, and the car drives off. The cold case. Even though this did not solve the mystery of where their daughter was because they had no idea what car this was, who was driving it, or where they were going, Mary and Dave still felt relieved because, from their perspective, it seemed like their daughter had willingly got into this vehicle. Whoever it was, whatever they were doing, she had gotten in on purpose, which meant she probably was not being abducted, which was their big fear. Over the next couple of days, the police analyzed this footage and tried to get information about this car, but the footage was so grainy they couldn't do it. However, the police were telling Dave and Mary, hey guys, I'm sure Skylar is going to show up any day now. As much as you may not want to believe it, that your daughter is capable of running away, it is fairly common for teens to do that. They'll run away and then, a couple days later they'll pop back up. And so, I'm sure that's what's going on with Skylar. She chose to get in that car, and so I'm sure she will choose to get back in touch when she feels comfortable. So a couple of days go by, and the parents haven't heard anything from their daughter. And then a couple of weeks go by, still nothing. And then a couple of months go by, still nothing. And this is all despite the fact that there is a massive search happening led by the police. And locals in Morgantown have put flyers up everywhere that have pictures of Skylar and Ease's face. Everywhere in town and the neighboring towns, it was like you could not go 5 feet without being reminded that this girl is missing. Have you seen her? If you have, give us information. Despite the amount of publicity this case was getting, no one came forward with any meaningful information. It was like Skylar had just vanished, and no one had a clue what happened to her. Her parents were obviously devastated that they had no idea what happened to her, but they were kind of holding on to this idea that, maybe she did run away, and maybe she will eventually be in touch with us. But by December of that year, so 6 months after Skylar had gone missing, no one had heard from her, no one had seen her, no one had any idea where she was. There were no new leads. And so people were starting to feel less and less optimistic, and the case was starting to kind of go cold. And then, on December 12th, something totally unexpected happened that changed everything. On that night, Rachel, the other friend who had been there with Sheila and with Skylar on the night that Skylar had vanished, she has a full-blown nervous breakdown. In fact, it's so bad that she's screaming and running around, and she's punching her family members, and her mom actually calls the police on her. 911, what is your emergency? I have an issue with a 16-year-old daughter of mine. I can't control her anymore. She's screaming. She's running through the neighborhood. Give me the phone. No. This is over. This is over. Hurry up. No, don't do it. She just gave me a black eye. Oh God, hurry up. Please. After this call was made, the police show up to Rachel's house and they take her away to a psychiatric hospital. And then several days later, when she was released from that hospital, she went straight to the Morgantown Police Department. She walked inside and said, I gotta get something off my chest. About Skylar, apparently. Whatever it was that she had been keeping secret had just been too difficult to keep inside. It was quite literally driving her crazy. And so the police said, okay, great, and they brought her into an interview room. They sat down and they said, okay, what do you got for us? The following has been pulled from what Rachel told police. The real night of July 5th. Back on July 5th, 2012, Skylar came home from that night shift at Wendy's. She goes inside her family's apartment. She says goodnight to her mom and dad. She goes into her bedroom and she shuts the door. She's laying on her bed. She's on her phone. She's not going to bed quite yet. And as she's laying there, she starts getting text messages from Rachel and also from Sheila, asking her if she wants to sneak out that night. Now, Skylar didn't want to, and she said as much because she was actually hurting. She was mad at her friends. According to some of her other friends that went to school with her and Rachel and Sheila, the three of them were totally inseparable. But lately, kind of the few months leading up to when she ultimately disappeared, there had been tension in their group. It seemed like Sheila and Rachel were getting very close and kind of pushing Skylar away. And Skylar was starting to pick up on it. It was little things like Sheila and Rachel would show up to school in matching outfits, but they wouldn't tell Skylar beforehand, kind of leaving her out. Or whenever they posted selfies of the three of them, Skylar was always relegated to the back or kind of in some other way obscured to make sure she was not the focal point of the picture. It was just very obvious that they were deprioritizing Skylar, and it was really hurting Skylar's feelings. And so it seemed like her way of standing up to them, and kind of telling them that she was upset, was to turn down their offer of sneaking out and smoking weed with them. But over the next couple of hours, Skylar would eventually say, okay, fine. You know, I'll come with you guys. I'll sneak out and we'll go smoke together. Just before 12. Zaro on July 6th, Skylar gets off of her bed. She walks over to her window. She lifts it up and she pulls the screen off. And she walks over to her closet. She puts the screen in her closet and shuts the door to the closet. And then she walks back over to the window and crawls out and lowers herself down onto the grass below. And then she walks over and grabs the bench and slides it over and puts it right underneath her window. And then she stands on the bench and reaches up and pulls the window down, so there's just a little crack left so she can get back inside. And then she just waited by the side of the apartment, looking out towards the road. And right after 12:30, this car, the unknown car on the surveillance camera, pulls right in front of the apartment building, and Skylar runs over to it, opens up the back right door and climbs inside. This unknown car was Sheila's car. Sheila was driving and Rachel was in the front passenger seat. It would turn out Rachel and Sheila lied about basically everything, including what time they picked up Skylar. The Pennsylvania border. So the three girls, they drive away from Skylar's apartment, and Sheila hops on a highway and starts driving northwest. Now, the girls did not immediately start smoking inside of the car. They decided instead they would actually drive to a location, get out, and smoke there. And the place they decided on was a spot they had smoked at before. It was a known hangout spot for teenagers. It was located about 45 minutes away, just barely across the border into Pennsylvania. It was down this kind of old country road that nobody ever went on. And so Sheila drives the car 45 minutes. She crosses into Pennsylvania. She finds the turn onto this old road. They drive down it a little ways until they're pretty far away from the highway, at which point Sheila pulls off the road onto the grass, parks the car. The three girls get out, and they walk past the car a little ways down the path to a clearing on the right. There was a hill that went up on the right, and they would kind of sit on this hill looking downhill, and that would be where they would smoke. And so the three girls, They sit down. They're all next to each other facing downhill. They're not facing each other at all. And Sheila, who was sitting all the way to the right with the car being over to the left, she pulls out the marijuana joint and she's about to light it, but she realizes she does not have a lighter. And so she asks Rachel and Skylar if they have a lighter, and they both pat themselves down. They're checking themselves. They don't have a lighter. And then Sheila says to Skylar, who's all the way to the left of the way they're sitting, "So Skylar is closest to the car." She asked Skylar, "Hey, can you go in the car and get the lighter that I know is in there? And Skylar said, "No problem." So Skylar, she stands up and she turns. Her back is to her two friends. And as soon as she starts walking, what she would have heard is the sound of her two friends standing up as well and then loudly saying, 1, 2, 3. And on 3, Skylar would have felt the knives being plunged into her back by Rachel and by Sheila. In a panic, Skylar does not even turn around. She just starts taking off running towards the car, and she manages to run away from her attackers. But because of her grievous injuries in her back, she eventually slows down, at which point Sheila tackles her from behind. She gets her on the ground, she pins her on her back, and Sheila is trying to stab Skylar, but Skylar is doing her best to keep the knife off of her. But at some point, Rachel comes running up beside them, and between Rachel and Sheila, they manage to hold Skylar's hands down, at which point Sheila and Rachel began taking turns stabbing her in the chest and in the neck. The whole time, Skylar is trying to defend herself, but it's impossible with these two on top of her. And at some point, she just kind of gives up and she says, "Why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me?" But they don't give her a reason. They just keep on going, and eventually, Rachel stops stabbing Skylar, but Sheila doesn't. Sheila keeps on going until, quote, her neck stopped making gurgling sounds. The kill kit. And then once Skylar went still, Sheila stood up like it was nothing, and she and Rachel just walked away from her body back to the car. They went around to the trunk of the car and they opened it up, and inside was shovels, bleach, trash bags, rags. They had brought along a kill kit because they knew what they were gonna do this night. So they start by cleaning themselves off. They get the blood off of them and off of their weapons, and then they take the shovels and they walk a little ways off of the road, kind of into the woods, and they tried to dig a grave. But it would turn out the ground was too hard, and so they abandoned the grave idea and just grabbed Skylar's lifeless body and drag it just about 6 feet off of the road and kind of chuck it against a log. And then they threw boulders and sticks and anything they could on top of her body. They don't know if she's still alive at this point, so they're potentially dealing the fatal blow with these rocks and logs. They cover her up until she's totally obscured. And then the two girls just walk back up. They grab their shovels, they grab their rags, their bleach, they put it back in the trunk. They hop in their car and they drive away. It would turn out Rachel and Sheila had been planning this for months. Reason: they didn't like Skylar anymore. And apparently, it wasn't enough to just be mean to her and not include her in things. They actually needed to kill her. And so the entire night that they went out and snuck out, that was all planned. They knew Skylar did not want to come out and sneak out with them because they knew she was upset with them. And so they said whatever they had to say to convince her to leave her house and sneak out with them. And so she did. She snuck out. And when she got in that car, Sheila and Rachel had their knives already in their front pocket of their sweatshirt, ready to go. And on their ride to the spot in Pennsylvania, Sheila and Rachel acted like, "Oh, let's just go to this spot and smoke," when in reality this was planned. They wanted to make sure they were far away from Morgantown when they killed Skylar. So when they got there and they walked down to their spot to actually begin smoking, Sheila and Rachel had intentionally not brought lighters, and Sheila had left a lighter in the car specifically so she could ask Skylar to go get it. Cause the plan was, as soon as Skylar gets up to get that lighter and her back is to us, Sheila and Rachel had promised each other that they would count to 3 and then attack her. Justice. Ultimately, Rachel would be sentenced to 30 years in prison, but she'll be eligible for parole in 2033. And Sheila would be sentenced to life in prison, but she would also be eligible for parole in 2028. During their trials, Rachel was very remorseful and even gave an apology to Skylar's parents during the sentencing phase. Sheila, on the other hand, smirked during her trial. For most of the time, she was smiling, untotally making light of it. She said she didn't do it, she was totally not remorseful, and she did not offer an apology to Skylar's parents. She did, however, leave an unbelievably cruel message on Twitter in March of 2013. When the police came out and officially said, "We have identified the remains in the forest in Pennsylvania as belonging to Skylar Nees," when that announcement was made, just a couple of days later, Sheila tweeted, "We really did go on 3." Sheila was arrested 1 month later. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please tell the like button you're going to upload 3, 4, even 5 times a week on your YouTube channel, and then drop it down to 2 or 3 times a week, and then 1 or 2 times a week, and then abruptly just go absent for 3 weeks straight. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to Shop Mr. Ballin. Code. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is Shop Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username is the same for both platforms. It's just Mr. Ballin. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also Mr. Ballin. We also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballin where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called our Amar Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. See you, Gemini in Hawaii. Today we're gonna look at 3 places you can't go, and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do. Then we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, at the like button's next birthday party, please gift them a 3-year supply of Ratatouille. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The Midnight Fisherman. On Monday, May 23, 2005, 37-year-old John Wilson got home from a very long day at work and immediately just collapsed into a sofa. John was an oil pipeline inspector in Houston, Texas, and that day it had been extremely hot, and he'd been driving around all these different job sites, and he'd been out in the sun, and he really hadn't had a break. And so now that he was home, he was totally exhausted and knew he should probably just go to bed. But he didn't want to. He didn't want to just go right to bed and then have to get back up again and go right back to work. He wanted to unwind before calling it a night. And so he decided what he would do to unwind would be to go fishing, something he really loved to do. Normally John did a lot of freshwater fishing, but tonight he decided he would do some saltwater fishing. And so, at about 7:30 p.m. that night, he grabbed his fishing rod and his tackle box. He threw it in the back of his pickup truck, and then he hit the road. About an hour and a half later, he had driven all the way south to the very coast of Texas to a beach called Crystal Beach, which is right on the Gulf of Mexico. Instead of parking in one of the parking spaces in the lot, John, like he always did, just drove right through the gate out onto the actual beach. This beach actually had a reputation for having really hard packs and almost like cement, because so many people like John would doctor their vehicles out onto the beach. And so he goes through the gate and he drives straight out towards the water. And although it wasn't completely low tide yet, it was making its way towards low tide. And so there was a lot of beach exposed. And so John drove for quite a while. And then he parked, still in the tidal zone, but well away from the water. John probably figured that he would not be there long enough for it to matter because high tide was not for several hours. And so John hops out of his truck, he preps his fishing rod, and he walks out into the actual surf and he begins to fish. It would have been very, very peaceful, as there was not really anyone else down there, as it was pretty much the middle of the night. There might have been a couple other fishermen nearby, but that was about it. And for a while, John probably just enjoyed the peace and quiet. He enjoyed fishing, and then after a while, John got overwhelmingly tired. Maybe it was from all the work earlier in the day out in the sun that was just finally catching up to him. Or maybe it was all the moving around in the surf getting knocked around by the water that was making him tired. Or maybe it was both. But either way, John decided he wanted to take a nap before he headed home again. So he left the surf zone, he dropped his fishing rod in the back of his truck, and then he crawled underneath his truck to take a nap. The following morning, a man who was out for a walk near Crystal Beach looked out into the water and he saw a truck was half submerged in the surf zone. So he called the police, and then the police called a tow truck. And then the tow truck driver showed up to the beach, and when he got there it was still relatively high tide. And so he had to wait until it was low tide enough that he could actually attach the chains and start pulling this truck out of the surf zone. And so finally, when it was low tide enough, the tow truck driver walked out. And as soon as he was standing next to this partially submerged vehicle, he saw there was a body poking out from underneath it. And that body belonged to John Wilson. No one knows for sure what happened to John after he climbed underneath this truck, but the best guess is after he went under there, he fell asleep and he slept for longer than he anticipated. And in that time frame, even though the sand of this beach had this reputation for being really, really hard, well, after a couple of hours, his truck would have begun to sink in the sand. It would have settled into the sand. And so John, as he's laying there, at some point would have been trapped by the underside of his truck. And then from that point, either the truck just continued to settle, ultimately crushing John to death, or it kept him pinned there, but he was still alive. And then the tide came in and eventually he drowned. Either way, John's final moments must have been torture. The final descent. Stevenica is a gorgeous town right in the heart of Slovenia, situated right along the Sava River, which is one of the longest rivers in Europe. The section of the Sava that flows past Stevenica was a popular destination for kayakers and canoeists up until 2008, when a hydroelectric dam was built across it, creating a sort of dead end for anyone trying to go through that section of the river. They would have to stop at the dam, get out, walk around, and then pick up the river on the other side, or that would mark the end of their trip. That day in 2008, while this dam was still under construction, the mayor of Stevenica, who was in favor of the construction of this dam, he understood that this was kind of a bummer for the people in town. While the dam itself was going to provide more electricity for the town, it did kind of end an era. And so he decided he would organize a final trip down the Sava River past the dam while they could still go right past it. And he was calling this trip the Final Descent. And so he went all around town asking people if they wanted to come, and he finally recruited 27 other people to come with him on this final trip. And so a few weeks later, on July 3rd, after all preparations were made, the mayor and the rest of his crew, they made their way upstream to this loading area where canoes had been set out for them. The staff people that had actually provided these canoes, they offered the group life jackets, and virtually everyone in the group turned it down. It's unclear why they turned down the life jackets, but one could guess that, the river itself was incredibly calm, and they were not expecting to be on the water for very long, and so they just decided they didn't need one. And so, after all 28 people got into their canoes, 7 people per canoe, they pushed off the shore and they began their slow trip down the river. And the mayor had actually hired a photographer to come along with them to document their journey. So as soon as they take off, the photographer is looking around, taking pictures and filming. The weather was beautiful and the water was calm, and everything was just going really welly. But about 15 or 20 minutes into their journey, they turned this corner and they got a clear view of the dam, which was about 1,000 feet away from them at the time. Now, the dam was not done yet, but it was pretty close to being done, And so the actual structure of the dam, it was built. And so even from 1,000 feet away, it was very obvious to tell that up ahead, there's these big cement archways where the water flows down over this dam. The whole group pretty much immediately saw they had a problem. The plan, according to the mayor, had been they would get to this dam. But on the left side of the dam, there was going to be a strip of waterway that had not been blocked off yet. Because when this dam was complete, it would completely obstruct the riverside to side. But because it wasn't actually done yet, the construction crew had told the mayor that, yep, the left side, there's gonna be an area where you can basically just casually go right past. You won't go down the dam. It's totally safe. But here this group is on the water, looking at the dam, and even from 1,000 feet away, it was obvious there was no side way to get around the dam. You clearly had to go through the dam, or you had to get out and go around the dam. Now the river was moving very, very slowly. There wasn't a strong current, and so there wasn't some urgent decision that needed to be made about what they were going to do. The group intuitively knew that the right choice here is to, go to the side, get out of your canoes, and either go around or just end the trip right there. But the mayor and a few of the other people in the other canoes got the idea that, hey, why don't we just go over the dam? I know we're not supposed to, and the construction crew explicitly said, don't go over the dam. It's extremely dangerous. But from the looks of it, it doesn't look that bad. And truthfully, it did not look too bad. This was not some enormous dam with some huge drop-off. It was actually a pretty small dam where the water kind of went down this fairly small embankment that was maybe 10 or 15 feet long. And at the bottom of this embankment was some semi-rough water. But overall, it just looked like it might be kind of fun to go down the dam, like you'd be going down a slide with your canoe. And so the mayor was really keen on doing this. He made it seem like it was going to be fun, it was going to be an adventure. And so before long, 3 of the 4 canoes were fully on board with the idea of just going over the dam. The 4th canoe that was not prepared to go over the dam had the photographer in it, and they said, we're not comfortable with this, but we'll pull up next to the dam and we'll just film you guys going over the dam. It'll be really cool. And so after making their plans about who was going to do what, the 4 canoes continued down the river. And when they got about maybe 100 or 200 feet away from the entrance to this dam, the 4th canoe with the photographer pulled off on the left side of the river. They got out and the photographer lifted up his camera, and he began filming the other 3 canoes as they made their approach into the dam. Now, the video from this photographer that was released to the public, it shows the first of these 3 canoes actually going into the dam. And you see these 7 people on this canoe, they're kind of happy and excited looking. They have nervous anticipation, like they're about to start a roller coaster or something, and they're making their way into this dark section inside of the dam. They're basically going through the gates of the dam where they're going to go down this embankment. And as they go into the darkness, as you begin to lose sight of them, you see the back end of the canoe suddenly pops up because now they're going down the actual dam itself. They start sliding down, and then you hear someone in the canoe start to scream. And then it goes completely silent, and then the video just ends. That canoe, right after it slid down that downslope, it would reach the waters below, but the canoe would capsize, throwing everyone on board into the water. And these 7 people, they didn't even have a chance to catch their breath before they were sucked under. Not only because the water was rough at the bottom of the dam and kind of was churning and pulling them under, but also because this is a hydroelectric dam. And at the bottom of the dam, underneath the water where they were all these big openings to underwater tunnels. And these tunnels function like vacuums. It pulled water down inside and then ran the water past a turbine, causing it to spin, and that would generate the electricity. That's what the dam actually did. And so after the water was pushed past this turbine, it would be jettisoned out somewhere else downstream. Now, even though this dam was not fully operational yet, these tunnels and the turbines at the bottom of them, they were operational. So as these 7 people are dumped into these incredibly dangerous waters and they're getting pulled down towards these tunnels, the other 2 canoes, they have no idea what's going on with this first canoe. And so they just continue on and they go over the dam. The second canoe that went down the dam, they also capsized at the bottom. All 7 occupants were thrown out, and they were sucked down underwater almost immediately. The third canoe that went over the dam, they did not capsize. And so after they cleared the dam and kind of paddled away, they began looking around for the other 2 canoes that should have already been down there. And there was nobody out in front of them. And so they turned around thinking maybe they're closer to the dam, and they don't see anyone. But they see one of the canoes is completely flipped over, and the other canoe has been broken apart in the churning waters right at the base of the dam. And they see the wood from this canoe just getting tumbled around. And so this third canoe immediately turns and tries to paddle over to the base of this dam to try to start pulling people out of the water. But when they get over there, there's no one there. The 14 people that had been in these 2 canoes, they're gone. Ultimately, 13 of the 14 people that fell in the water that day would perish. And one of the fatalities was the mayor. The only person who survived who fell in the water was actually the mayor's wife, who by some miracle managed to swim out of the grasp of these tunnels under the water and made it to shore. Over the next several days and weeks, police divers were able to eventually find all 13 bodies, one of which had traveled 25 miles away to Croatia. No information was given about the state of the bodies when they were found. And so, we don't know if having been sucked down through these tunnels and forced past these underwater turbines played a role in their death. All the public knows is that all, or most, of these 13 people were sucked down into these tunnels and then they died. Full transparency. This next story was pretty difficult to put together because the details of what actually happened to the victim are just really difficult to decipher. And so I think I've been very thorough and I've done a good job describing what happened. But I'm willing to accept it if I'm not right and this is actually inaccurate. And if you think I am, feel free to let me know in the comments. With that said, here we go. The Carousel of Progress. In 1974, 18-year-old Debbie Stone landed what she considered to be an amazing summer job. She was hired to work at Disneyland in Anaheim, California. Her specific role was to be a hostess at a brand new attraction called America Sings. Disney had basically converted an old carousel, which is a ride that spins around in a circle. They had converted it into a rotating stage. And they put up partition walls all along this rotating stage to create 6 distinct stages on this rotating stage. So, on each of these 6 stages were different sets of these robotic animals that played different songs about America. And so, the way this would work, if you were in the audience, is you would walk into this theater that looked like a single theater with one stage right in front of you. But really, what you were looking at is one of these 6 stages. And so the audience would sit down, they would see one of the acts, they'd see one performance on one of the stages, and then the stage would rotate. And so the audience would remain in the theater until all 6 stages had rotated in front of them and played their 2 to 4 minute long act. Debbie's job at America Sings was at the beginning of these shows where the audience would watch all 6 acts. She would go up before the very first act, she'd go on stage and she would greet the audience, and then the show would start. It would filter through all 6 of the stages, and then Debbie would get back on stage and she would say goodbye to that group of audience members. It was a simple gig and Debbie seemed to like it. And so on July 9th of that year, which was 9 days after this attraction had opened, and so it was 9 days after Debbie had started her job, Debbie was asked to come in for an evening shift. And so she left her house and she made it out to the attraction at about 10:00 p.m., which was right at the start of a show. And so she went right inside, she hopped on stage, she greeted the audience, and then she left the stage and the show began. And so over the next 30 minutes, all 6 of the stages performed their acts. And then after the 6th act was done, Debbie dutifully climbed back onto the stage. She said goodbye to the audience. And then as that audience was leaving the theater, she turned around and walked towards the back of the stage she was on. What happened next requires some additional explanation. Each of the 6 stages that made up this attraction had a fairly tall back wall. And behind each of these 6 back walls, that were kind of in a ring, was the center of the actual attraction. And in the center was the circular, fairly tall storage room. This storage room did not rotate. It was stationary. The stages in their respective back walls, they rotated around the storage room. The gap between the outside of the storage room at any point around it and the inside of the back wall was maybe a couple of inches. It was pretty narrow, but it was big enough that a person in theory could get stuck back there. So, it was a real hazard. However, Disney did not put any specific safeguards in place to prevent their staff from intentionally or unintentionally going into the space. They just told their staff to not go back there and be careful. So back on July 9th, after Debbie has said goodbye to the audience and she's walked towards the back of the stage she's on, she decides to move from the stage she's on to the adjoining stage. And when she does that, she either trips or falls, or something happens which causes her to fall into the narrow space between the two back walls of the two stages she was on. And so she falls through that gap and then gets wedged between the outside of the storage room and the back of one of the back walls. She tries to pull herself up and pull herself out of the space, but she realizes she's stuck. And so she starts to panic and she starts screaming for help. None of the staff hear her, or they don't recognize that this is a real call for help. And this new wave of people that are coming in, the new audience, they're all talking loudly, there's music playing, they don't really hear her, and anyone that actually did hear her calling for help, they would later say they thought it was part of the show. The rotation. And so, as Debbie is screaming bloody murder, she cannot get out of this gap, this narrow gap she's stuck in, these stages. They start to move because the show is going to start. And because Debbie has nowhere to go when the stage began to rotate, she got forcibly dragged and twisted and rolled. And her body began to contort and bones started to break. And she was forced to continue moving through this narrow space because the stage was just going to keep on going until it reached its next position. And so finally, after it dragged her all the way to its next position, Debbie didn't die. She was grievously injured. She probably had dozens of broken bones, but she was alive and she's still totally stuck. And she's screaming with every ounce of energy she has. But again, the audience, even though they heard her screaming, they assumed it was part of the show. And apparently the staff also heard her screams and convinced themselves it was just no big deal. And so 2 to 4 minutes later, when the act was complete, the stage began to rotate again. So Debbie again is rolled and contorted and crushed and dragged and smashed and broken as the stage again rotates to its next position. And she's still not dead. She's screaming out for help. No one is coming to help her. And so the entire show would play out with the stage rotating through all of its sections. And then finally, at the end of the show, when one of the audience members alerted the staff that, hey, you should really go check out that screaming we heard. And at that point, they went for a look and they discovered Debbie, and she was very obviously deceased. Disney would pay a small settlement to Debbie's family, and then they would put up a number of safeguards on the America Sings attraction to make sure something like this never happened again. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, at the like button's next birthday party, please give them a 3-year supply of Roddy-Thor. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like hats and flannels and mugs and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested in purchasing official Mr. Ballin merch, go to Shop Mr. Ballin. If you want to see upcoming deals and promotions for our merchandise, go to our Instagram page. The username is Shop Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same, it's just John Ballin for 116. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. We also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page called Mr. Ballin, where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, Just Called or MR Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination. Just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya.